What do you think specifically about Sheriff Joe Arpaio?
I'm not a big fan of Arpaio. My impression, just in watching his interviews and stuff, is that he's kind of got a bit of an ego trip. I mean, the scary part about how physically visceral some of our local law enforcement technologies are getting in the hands of people like Arpaio, who are just normal, ordinary. Yeah, I mean, what you're talking about is in parts of the country some very religiously motivated, very sort of power-hungry zealots who then have the disposal of military generals, but in our own backyard.
And then the trickle-down theory is what happens to the family's life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, they lose a parent, and then
Right.
the kids end up on the street, and then they become unparented, and then they become wild and crazy and on drugs or, you know, in a game.
Not only that, but in black neighborhoods, you're talking about a significant decline in the number of adult males. And it's not just a matter of a single household not having a father. It's a matter of an entire community not having adult males to control adolescence. A common refrain in anthropology research coming out of welfare offices, food stamp programs, and unemployment offices is that single African-American female mothers basically report fear and an inability to discipline and control their teenage gang member children. At the community level, having that much of your population incarcerated just really has these very problematic effects.
And me being a minority, a white person, college educated, that was thrown into prison, into county jail, and going in through the system and sitting in the welfare offices, I was the only white person. I mean, I'm sitting with all Mexicans or black women, like you're saying, and I'm like, you know, I think one time I dragged my sister to one of those things, and she was like, Allison, what are you doing? So, well, I have to do it, you know, because I'm a single mother that doesn't get child support, and they took away my career. The prison system took away I made $200,000 a year.
Well, let's not get off the track here. You know, Daniel, one of the things that I really like about your work is that it's so practical. Now, I ran for offices a couple of times in the last couple of years. Most recently, I ran for county commissioner. And one thing that I have found is that that in local elections, what the voters really respond to are questions about money. Basically, when it comes to local politicians, their one and only concern seems to be who is the best steward of my money. And for that reason, these questions really seem to resonate with voters. And can you speak to that? Is this something that seems to be a way of creating an issue that doesn't seem to be real popular with voters, and turning around and making it into something that is pertinent and important to their lives?
Well, I appreciate your comment on my work being particularly practical. I hope it's perceived that way. I think what you're saying in terms of voters, for many Americans, for voters, for ordinary people, money talks, especially in local politics, and I think that makes sense. Unfortunately, that's basically the challenge that's in front of us on issues like this. I'm very much inspired by two key theoretical texts for a lot of my research. One is a book by James Buchanan and Richard Wagner called Democracy in Deficit, The Legacy of Lord Keynes. And in that book, what they talk about is fiscal spending by government creating new interest groups that perpetuate continual spending in those areas. So in public education, for example, if you spend $1 million to grow education, then that's a pretty easy political campaign to run, to say, oh, I'm in favor of education, I want to spend more on education. People hear that and they say, well, education's a good thing, I support more education, don't you care about the children, so on and so forth. But once you get that spending in, now you've got real people, real business production lines, real physical infrastructure dedicated to that education system. If that education system starts to fail to perform, well, it becomes more difficult to correct it because now we've got all new political interests motivated to keep it insulated, to keep it growing, to keep that spending going. Arguably, the same thing is happening in our criminal justice system. So the criminal justice system is drifting from being responsive to the real and practical needs of safety, security, law enforcement, and decreasing crime, and more is it responsive to political interests, job creation of police unions, job creation of jail unionists, of the companies that are responsible for manufacturing the equipment and the architectural infrastructure of incarceration. So I see that as a very significant problem. The other side, and the other book that very much inspires me, is a book by Brian Kaplan. It's much more recent. It's called Myth of the Rational Voter. And Kaplan's research demonstrates that on a variety of economic issues, voters are worse than ignorant. They are systematically biased. In other words, if you asked people to estimate how much money we spend on foreign aid, how much our deficit is, so on and so forth, it's not that you get random answers. It's not that people just pick numbers out of a hat. It's actually that they systematically error in the same way. We overestimate how much money is spent on foreign aid. We underestimate how much our deficit is. In criminal justice, these same patterns come out of the public opinion research. If you look at how much people perceive crime in their neighborhoods, they think that people are getting murdered right outside their door. They think that the average sentence is very, very low for severe crimes. They think that the average prison population is much less than what it actually is. So people generally think that crime is really bad. They generally think that we're spending very, very little on fixing it. So when policy comes down the pipeline that says we're going to spend more to fix this problem, they tend to support those issues. Once it's in public policy space, that's when the democracy and deficit logic, the interest group sort of aspect takes over. Neither of these two mechanisms, whether it's the sort of systematic failures of the voting population or the systematic biases of the special interest groups, none of them are directly tangible and linked to safety, security, quality proxies of our real social environment.
You know, I had a fairly lengthy talk with Gary Johnson, the former governor of New Mexico, who is now the Libertarian candidate for president, and he won by quite a large majority in New Mexico. Which was pretty surprising because he was a Republican in a state that's about 2/3 Democrats. But his stance on practically everything was to look at everything as a cost-benefit analysis. And when people look at it that way, it seems to be something that people are able to understand. And the governor of Michigan ran on a similar platform, and it seems to be something that people seem to be able to grasp nowadays, which is why I think that your economic way of looking at the prison problem is practical, and it really has some chance of success.
I mean, I appreciate these compliments to my research, and I hope that you're correct. I think that the last form of real challenge that people, from my perspective, face in contemporary politics is things like it gets to a point where what we're really doing is challenging the presumptions of the role of government. If you, again, think in terms of education spending, military spending, domestic law enforcement spending, these are arenas of our society where spending growth in the last just a few decades has exponentially risen, right? We spend like 5, 6, 7 times more than we used to spend on education. Similarly in the criminal justice sector, whether you're talking about prisons, police, or court system. And similarly with military spending abroad. Now, in those areas, we haven't gotten comparable improvements in outcomes. Kids aren't smarter coming out of the school system. Streets aren't systematically safer in proportion to that increased spending, especially when you compare it at the international level. It's actually a significant tension amongst economists because since the 1990s, we have had this massive decline in violent crime, and so it looks at first glance like all of this spending is working. However, Canada and the UK are closest sort of relevant comparisons of developed economies, English-speaking world, relatively ethnically diverse, similar comparisons to the United States. They've had the same crime decline since the 1990s, but they haven't incarcerated all of these people, and they're not spending all of this money on doing it.
Actually, I understand that the UK has had kind of a crime spree since they pretty much eliminated guns in jolly old England, and that seems to essentially made it into murder central more than Chicago. At one point.
When guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns.
Yeah, my sentiments exactly. Just the same though, the idea of looking at things from an economic standpoint is something that I find that when I speak in front of a group of people, I find that I have completely left the opposition totally without any response. Very few people have really thought about of how to implement processes that are going to address these issues, how we're going to be better stewards of their money, how we're going to look at the cost-benefit analysis of what is working and what's not working. And although I was running essentially as a libertarian Republican, I wasn't expected to win. I did do far better than what people have projected that I would do in that race, and that's very encouraging to me.
Now, what are you doing right now, Dan?
Right now, I'm sitting on my couch.
No, are you professing down there in New Orleans?
Yep.
Sure, I'm a full-time faculty member at Loyola University in New Orleans. I teach what's referred to as a 3-2 teaching load. It's 3 classes in the fall and 2 in the spring. Typically, our whole department is very, I guess you could call it, liberty-minded. Many of us associate with what's called the Austrian School of Economics. Probably the most well-known of my colleagues is Professor Walter Block, renowned for his sort of infamous book, Defending the Undefendable. I'm sort of responsible for the principal sequences to sort of to get exposure to large class sections of freshmen and sophomore college students who haven't really been exposed to the economic way of thinking, cost-benefit analysis, rational choice frameworks of social science, and to get them excited about economics and seeing the world through economic lenses.
Well, I think it's wonderful that freedom advocates are starting to make some type of impact in academia. I know that Mises really never found a teaching post throughout his career when he was in the U.S. and struggles his entire life. What is the outcome? What does the outlook look like for for Austrian economists. It sounds like it's getting a little bit better than what it was just a few years ago. There certainly seems to be a lot more interest in classical and Austrian economics.
Well, I definitely think a lot of there's sort of two fronts. One tactic has been to stalk the conventional game in the economics profession. And I can't think of anyone in the sort of youngest generation of Austrian scholars who's done that better than Peter Leeson, who's on my dissertation committee. He's a good friend of mine. And what he's been doing is just really, really good historical research that has the ability to be relevant to some very serious discussions in economic theory. The question of how far we can stretch the application of voluntary self-enforcing exchanges without the necessity of government enforcement. And so his research has really focused on underground criminal markets and organization amongst criminal networks to look at how it is, in the absence of conventional legal systems and conventional law enforcement, people manage to trade, people manage to profit, and people manage to develop rules for their society that don't have this the conventional form of police, courts, and prisons in order to promote an organized and orderly system of society. Now, the other front is taking the unique insights from the Austrian tradition and bringing them into these, again, sort of like major and high-ranking discussions in different disciplines. So a colleague and friend, Chris Coyne, is really focused on international relations and military reconstruction. Another friend and colleague, Virgil Storr, is really interested in sociology and the cultural implications of capitalism and knowledge sharing that takes place in market economies. And I'm trying to work in inroads with criminology and criminal justice.
Well, that's unique that you're able to do that well within the framework of mainstream thought. Sociology, for instance. I mean, sociology is basically it is fundamentally socialist, and Virgil Storr, I didn't catch that name. Has managed to kind of take that paradigm and turn it around and make it into something entirely different.
Well, I think that one of the biggest obstacles that freedom advocates or Austrians have confronted is like a martyrdom syndrome, sort of in homage to this Mises narrative that you put forward. A lot of people sit comfortably thinking that, oh well, I'm being biased against and the system is stacked against me. But I think instead the academic market works like a meritocracy. If you do good work, especially younger academics and younger scholars, I mean, people are not blind ideologues. They're interested in reading unique perspectives, and to a large extent, the freedom perspective is underrepresented, and so a lot of times we have the opportunity in some of these older and almost rusted out discussions to bring a very fresh and unique set of analytical tools and perspectives into these conversations.
Well, that's encouraging, and I think, as we discussed earlier, I'm one of the founders of the Roger Sherman Institute, and there does seem to be a market for freedom advocates out there, and one of the things that we are trying to promote is freedom advocates in political sciences. There seems to be a need for people with that kind of background and that sort of training. The Tea Party has been somewhat successful in getting rid of the old rhinos and putting in new people. They haven't been quite as successful in getting people that actually follow through once they get into those positions of power, very often they seem to be swallowed up by the system. And I think, to be charitable about it, perhaps they don't have the skills to be able to function in a situation like that, and therefore they take the easy course, which is just to follow the lead of the political bosses.
Sure. I think that these opportunities for the freedom perspective in higher academy are only going to grow in years to come. I mean, higher education is sort of changing by the day. Everything from online-based coursework to high unemployment rates, questionable future of student loan programs, etc. We at Loyola, for example, we've got about 5 or 6 students who came to Loyola just to study with our department because our department had this reputation out via the internet and our publications. And so I think that you're going to see a lot more students holding off going into college out of high school, right? Wanting to know precisely what they're going to study before they decide to spend tens of thousands of dollars on higher education. And as they start to do that, they're going to be more discretion with regard to the substance of the material that they learn. And so a lot of these departments that are populated with sort of like middle-aged and what's often called deadwood academics who are less engaged and less meaningfully practically relevant in contemporary society because they're sort of clinging to old frameworks of quasi-Marxism, etc., they're going to have to think more critically about how to stay competitive in that changing environment.
Yeah, that's well said, and that's terribly encouraging to hear that. And also, the Mises Institute is shown that online education is a viable alternative for many people, and that it's possible with technology to get a superior education. In fact, perhaps a better education than you can in brick and mortar schools, and they can do that at a fraction of the cost. And that's another encouraging sign. It seems to be changing the paradigm of education. There are many of the old guard that are concerned that their job won't be there anymore, but that happens whenever there's a new technology. And really what seems to be happening is
it as much fun, though? No,
well, I think it's more fun because I think that, well, yeah.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah, right. There's the partying aspect of it that they may miss out on. That's a valid point. But what I'm getting at is that for the professors, the mundane sort of day-to-day chores of standing in front of 200 students and goes, x squared plus y squared and that sort of thing, which it's got to be just as painful for the professor it is for the students. That is not necessary anymore. Instead, the more creative aspects of teaching are something that the professors are going to be able to spend a lot more time on. Is that kind of been your experience? Have you been involved? I know with Mises. How was your experience with doing online education?
I mean, to me, I don't think it's completely substituting for the live interaction, but I do think that there's probably going to be a significant restructuring, whether or not we have these like all year long semesters where students attend classes on a daily basis, etc. To me, doesn't seem like the most efficient way of communicating ideas. Instead, perhaps having a wide, diverse offering of everything from reading materials to testing materials to video conferencing to Web 2.0 access to faculty, and then perhaps more like tangible event spaces where students have opportunities to interact with faculty in real space, which is arguably a lot of what organizations like the Mises Institute, the Institute for Humane Studies, Foundation for Economic Education. I mean, not only do I do some of the online stuff with Mises, but I do summer lecturing for a lot of these organizations. And one of the feedbacks that we get from students systematically, like regularly, is they say, I don't understand why my college experience is not as intellectually fulfilling and satisfying and enlightening as this 3-day, 4-day, 5-day seminar has been. And here's this 4 or 5-day seminar that was free to them. And they got like a stack full of free books that like the faculty and the institutions coordinated donors in order to provide. So I do think that that sort of looser model it might have a significant benefit in terms of, or comparative advantage in terms of actually educating people and inspiring them to want to learn like these historical theoretical traditions. Now, the question is going to be for higher education how to accomplish those signaling effects, the credentialing aspect. That's going to be the major question moving forward, I think, especially in light of, to tie it back to sort of these criminal justice issues, it's hopeful insofar as many of the populations who are most susceptible to the criminal justice system are systematically undereducated. They're high school dropouts. The average likelihood of an African-American male in the United States today to go to prison is higher than it is for him to get married or go to college. And so having a low-cost alternative to at least get the tangible skill sets that are provided through higher education and high school education hopefully will give some of these people a significant outlet to avoid the criminal justice system.
Now, a lot of this is in your thesis, right? That imprisonment dilemma.
The imprisoner's dilemma.
And where can we find that?
That's available through the George Mason University Library. It's in digital form. You can download it for free.
Okay.
There should be also a link on my website, danieljdemico.com. In economics, there's a very popular game theory concept called the prisoner's dilemma. And the prisoner's dilemma, if you've seen A Beautiful Mind, was innovated by John Nash, and it's just an argument that it's sort of a restatement of the Hobbesian jungle. If everyone were left to their own devices, it could be the case that we are prone to rape, pillage, and plunder one another as opposed to truck, barter, and exchange. And so the argument for the social contract, for the need of formal enforcement of law and order by means of police, courts, prisons, etc., is that we need to tip the scales of incentives for ordinary individuals to keep us from raping, pillaging, and plundering one another, and instead promoting us to truck, barter, and exchange with one another to get along peaceably.
I think an important question to look at in regards to that theory is, why do people wear clothes? I mean, think about it. I mean, certainly we would be more comfortable if we went around naked all day. I mean, you could say that, you know, legally we're required to wear clothes. But the fact is that the people wear clothes because of there's a strong stigma about it. It's something that's very much in our nature that we would be very uncomfortable if we ran around naked all day. And I think that it says that we're more than just animals. That there is a certain innate morality that humans have. So for that reason, the prisoner's dilemma is not quite as simple as that people would just simply take the easiest, most profitable way out. That they tend to do the right thing. They tend to do the moral thing.
So one aspect of my research is that answering or chiming into exactly what you point out, that the bulk of social order in our society is not the consequence of smart people designing law enforcement to keep us all from devolving into chaos, but instead from the natural incentives of ordinary people cooperating with one another, that our informal social institutions, our culture, our religions, our churches, our clubs and groups, they contribute to a world where we can peaceably coexist, arguably in a greater magnitude than our formal institutions. The second aspect is to ask, well, if we're admitting to the fact that ordinary individuals might have this bad aspect to ourselves, that we're willing to cheat and rob and pillage from one another, then who is it that is responsible for designing and implementing formal law enforcement to keep us from doing this? I mean, this is sort of Madison's question in the Federalist Papers. Who guards the guardsmen? If we admit to this necessity for formal law enforcement, then it could be the case that that institution's ability to calculate how much police, how much punishment, it might lack the necessary forms of information. It might lack the necessary incentives to calculate those things optimally or in ways that promote good social order. It might actually like sow the seeds of its own destruction in that sense.
Perhaps there's ways of incorporating free market economics into the system. It might be a bridge to creating a real libertarian society if we can demonstrate that through market forces that the outcomes can actually be better. They can be more moral. They can be more intelligently used. They can be done in a more creative sort of way. And again, it gets back to cost-benefit analysis. What is the benefit? We put an enormous amount of money and resources into our prisoner system, and what have we accomplished? One person out of 100 is in prison right now, and are we really any safer than we were before?
My friend from New York, he's a multi-billionaire. He did the stats for me. For what was it? For 200 false arrests over 10 years, it cost taxpayers $30 billion.
The cost is enormous. In fact, that's really what government does. Their real goal is to what government really does is destroy wealth rather than create wealth. And perhaps it's more about acquisition of power and control than it is about what they claim it is, which is making lives better for us.
But people don't know about the innocent people like the Ron Tineys, or the guy that's going to be on our show next week, Ray Krone. He spent 10 years in prison on death row for a crime he didn't commit, and he walked out and got a huge settlement. So it's like, he didn't see the light of day for 10 years.
Yeah, it seems like that would wake people up when Ray Krone got an enormous amount of money, wasn't it? He's a rather wealthy man now.
But some walk out with just the shirt on their back after 36 years.
Usually they do. Yeah. Usually they're just dropped off in front of the prison with a snide remark like, "See you next week, Joe. I know you can't stay away from this place. There's no sense in losing a good customer." And honestly, although they might not be right up front about it, that is one of the outcomes of having a private prison system. And that even in their newsletters, they talk about how legalizing marijuana may actually reduce their profits in the private prison system. It's a perverse incentive. What can we do to start changing this? Is there any hope?
I do think that there is significant hope insofar as there are a number of examples of social organizations and communities that effectively function without these problematic institutions. It's sort of a different question of how we make what we're stuck with today significantly better. But it is reason to not sort of give up all hope, I would suppose. I think that the biggest problem we face in contemporary circumstances is the fact that, yes, there are these elaborate networks of incentives and special interests that favor the system as it exists right now. And that's not in a way that's like they're out to get us and they're plotting or cohorting in like conspiratorial sense. It's more like the system is sort of a mindless bureaucracy that you can really, unfortunately, be stuck in. I mean, it's not that the judge hates you or dislikes you. It's that the judge sees 100 people in the course of that day and is trying to minimize his own costs of operation and deal with his own sort of constraints that are irrespective of any one person's sort of individual plight. But the whole system is sort of stretched to its brink on that sense. And I think that, like, what I think is the ideal strategy of promoting freedom and prosperity in the future is the educational project, is having a greater mass of people who have a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between freedom and liberty on the one hand and the good stuff that comes out of society on the other, prosperity, trade, as well as quality of life. And I think if we strengthened that knowledge base, then it would be more difficult for these sort of like mindless bureaucracies to encroach upon our civil liberties and our economic liberties. If people really valued them and put them in the forefront of their intellectual and ideological preferences.
Well, we found that it's very, very difficult. I've been involved in politics for a number of years to try to change things at the federal level. It's very difficult at the state level. It seems like where it's been successful, if it's successful at all, it's usually been at the local level. One strategy is, I think we discussed before, jural societies, which is essentially to take control of your own community at a local level and just simply tell the state, you can do whatever you want with your federal money, with your tax, with your with those grants, but we don't really need it over here. We're self-sufficient. We have schools that are self-supporting. We have our own jural system. We have our own enforcement system that seems to work in this community. Where it's been a good example where it's been successful is that there have been several tribal jural societies that have been recognized by, for instance, the Michigan Supreme Court, the Attorney General in the state of Michigan, Jennifer Granholm, recognized the Jural Society in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, and Jennifer Granholm went on to become the governor of Michigan. What do you think of that? Do you have any thoughts on Jural Societies?
I read a lot about those sort of cases, and I think that this issue in particular is perhaps one of the reasons why there's such animosity and tension between disciplines in the academy, for example. In large part because it's very difficult to disaggregate issues of class and issues of race in the contemporary criminal justice system from these sort of potentials for civil society. In other words, when you start to talk about the private enforcement of law, we're seeing that happen. We have private neighborhoods, we have condo associations, we have neighborhood associations where people are basically providing their own forms of police. Now, yes, we live in a world where things like drugs and prostitution are illegal, but within the confines of these private communities, you're much less likely to be subjected to the mindless bureaucratic aspects of our criminal justice system. If a 13-year-old kid walks down his privately gated neighborhood in Palm Beach County, Florida, smoking a joint, he's not going to get arrested and thrown in jail for weeks on end and sort of disappear in the system in much the same way as an inner-city kid in New Orleans might end up disappearing for months on end as a consequence of being caught with a small amount of illicit substances on him. However, I think that's so a lot of sort of critical commentary on the left would say that this is an unjust system because it allows the rich to buy their way out of justice. On the one hand, I think that's almost a naive perception because it ignores the fact that these sort of private involvement of civil societies going on in the lower ends of the class spectrum as well. The Black Panther movement was, in essence, a private entrepreneurial capitalist endeavor to avoid police brutality. They basically said, we're going to deter crime so that no one will need to call these corrupt police officers. And so I think that the lower classes and the poor environments are actually some of the most accustomed to having to think creatively about civil society provision of social order in today's world.
Yeah, I hadn't really recognized the connection before between the Black Panthers and girl societies. That is an interesting reference that there are many different ways of approaching this, and really when these type of organizations evolve, essentially they evolve around a notion of natural law. And natural law seems to be a system of laws in which is discovered, not created. There are certain eternal truths that people seem to discover, and whether it's a society in Africa or whether it's an ancient society in Ireland, the Brehon Law Society of ancient Ireland, these principles seem to be more or less universal, and perhaps that's something that is the way that this situation is evolving. I see sort of a revolution, not a revolution where people take up guns against the most powerful military organization in the history of the world, but a sort of revolution where people just quietly decide to take care of things themselves, where the federal government comes up with some obscene new law, and people's reaction is, ha ha ha, that's funny, and they just go about their lives and do it as right. It's right. As you said, it requires education, and it requires people that understand and know who they are. The one thing that the government just doesn't seem to be able to deal with is when people just simply ignore them.
I think that's right. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily characterize these principles as universal, but they do seem to be necessary. In other words, yes, you can have a society that doesn't necessarily have private property rights, but it's certainly not going to be a prosperous society, and it's certainly not going to be enduring or robust against various other sort of exogenous shocks, whether that be natural disaster or conflict amongst other societies, etc. If you expect if your insistence upon a community or a civilization is advancement, progressive improvement of the living conditions of the people within it, accumulation of wealth and prosperity for those people, and a peaceable coexistence with peoples of other cultures and places, then yes, then there are some things in our social experience that you must accomplish. One would probably be a fair system of judicial interpretation. Another would be private property rights, and another would be things like stable monetary currencies, etc. Now, the challenge there is that size and growth and sort of the potentials for bureaucratic creep threaten all of these forms of stability. And so a lot of what my work focuses on is how accumulation of police powers and accumulation of incarceration threatens these otherwise necessary facets of functioning social order. It's almost impossible to expect a fascist regime to just let everybody out of the Gulag system and say, okay, we'll just protect property and liberty from here on out. Once they have the sort of weaponry and arsenal and technologies of enforcement in place, it's very difficult to expect them not to use it. And so all of these transition questions of how we turn back the clock of state growth is basically where the discussion is at today.
Yeah, that's a good point. Your article on ancient Greek incarceration was interesting. I think a lot of people do not realize that the prisons is fairly new technology. That there actually was laws. There actually was a system other than anarchy before we gave the state this enormous new tool for incarcerating their citizens. And since then, it seems to have been a enormous incentive for growth and power and in government. Can you describe what it was like before we had this incarceration system? It wasn't. And by the way, I like in your article you didn't seem to paint a rosy picture of the way Greek society was prior to the incarceration system. There were problems back then.
The first reason is we simply don't have a huge body of evidence to describe that system inside and out. There are a few key sources that historians and scholars like myself have used in order to recreate what we can best presume the system was like. But I would go one step further, that it's not just the mechanism of incarceration that makes a significant change in ancient Greece, as well as sort of our more contemporary Anglo-Saxon or Western world. It's really criminal law in general is a very new phenomenon. In other words, before the mechanism of incarceration in the ancient world, and what we can sort of see as a life cycle of civilization. The life cycle of civilization existed in the ancient world, and then it sort of dies off for a significant period of time, and then reinstigates itself in the Western, like Anglo-Saxon European case. Now, in both of those circumstances, the original sort of origins of the state and the criminal law and the criminal enforcement of law by means of incarceration are all coeval with one another. In other words, prior to the existence of formal government, you don't necessarily have a criminal law. You don't necessarily have a prison system. And what's really tragic about our moral philosophy is that we think in terms of criminal law, in moral philosophical terms. Even libertarians that I talk to say things like, well, if you break the law, you should go to jail. And it takes a very creative person to say, well, maybe that's not the right way that we should respond to those behaviors in society. We're just calling that crime, but in lots of different places, in lots of different times, in lots of different cultures, things like drug use weren't always criminal. Things like certain aspects of otherwise voluntary transactions were not always criminal. And the things which most people, like you're noticing, are these universal aspects of law and order: murder, rape, theft, fraud, embezzlement, intentionally damaging other people's property, larceny, etc. Those things were handled with civil processes and civil adjudication. We have a civil court system that is basically an evolutionary response to dealing with these interpersonal conflicts that the state takes control over in the ancient world.
People back to work.
Say again?
Put the people back to work.
Put the people back to work, yeah.
And make them pay back some money. Take
well, compensation of the victim. In fact, I can give you an example of how that worked. I had a patient once when I was a paramedic that was shot in the back by his ex-wife, when he gave her the gun, he's the one who gave her the gun, by the way, and he said that, if anybody F's with you, then use this on him, and apparently he was the next guy that F'd with her, and he had an option of prosecuting her criminally, but the man was paralyzed and he needed to be able to survive, so he had the option of a civil remedy, and she was required to work and support him, which is the difference between civil and criminal. And in most traditional societies, it's all been about compensating the victim. The idea that you have offended the state is kind of a modern concept, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it?
Well, worse than that, it arguably has a corrupting influence. What I would like to submit as like a comparative example would be, take like the Casey Anthony case. Here we have a criminal trial that was sort of pumped through our Web 2.0 mass media culture, and there were people sort of screaming these visceral, it was like a mob rule scenario. Had the court system reflected the tastes and preferences of like all of these onlookers, they would have like hung the woman in the public square. It would have been this sort of hyper putative, visceral experience. Whereas when you look at reports of what's going on in what's called the restorative justice movement, where the actual victims and criminals are made to sit down and confront one another and like explain the courses of the crime, the motivations, etc., you're seeing tremendous amounts of like forgiveness, essentially. Victims are empathizing with the sort of like impoverishedness of their criminal perpetrators, and when these problems are handled at the individual level, we have a great potential of prudence and responsibility on the part of victims requesting compensation and recompense. Whereas when we treat these issues as matters of social justice, it actually brings out the worst in our collective social anxieties.
I noticed that with children. If children are able to pick out the punishment for their the other children, it's usually something that incredibly punitive, like ground them for a year, take away his allowance. People seem to have these very emotional responses, but under a civil system where it is about compensating the victim, then it requires the judges to be rational. For instance, in the Brehon system in ancient Ireland, both of the litigants had to agree on a judge or a Brehon. And in order for a Brehon, the judge, to be successful, he had to have a reputation for fairness. So it was a free market court system. And imagine how much more responsible and how much more ethical a court system that actually had to compete for their business would be.
Yeah, the Athenian system.
I know a lot of judges in Phoenix that would be in the gutter.
Yeah, they wouldn't be able to make it if they had to compete for a job at all.
No, they'd be 86.
You said something about the Athenian system, Daniel?
I mean, the role of reputation, the competitive nature of judges was all, like, I mean, I draw parallels to the Vergeld system of Iceland and the Anglo-Saxon period, the Legis Mercatorum. But there is evidence to suggest that judges were rewarded with financial compensation when they came up with rulings that were agreed upon by both plaintiffs and defendants. That worst case scenario, the sort of onlooking public, a very civic engaged community, held the rulings of judges in check, but also that the requests of the plaintiffs and defendants were held in check because you didn't want to come off as being unreasonable. If you like accidentally drove your car into my living room and I insisted that you be hung, everybody would think that I was totally unreasonable. And so I would ask for, well, you've got to make me whole again, plus whatever was lost in the interim, and so on and so forth. Vice versa, if you were the perpetrator and expecting to maintain reputation, you wanted to come off as seeming compliant with the court. If you ignored it, then essentially everybody knew that you were outside the law, which in the Anglo-Saxon system they had the outlaw process, where if you weren't compliant with a ruling that had been ruled over you, then basically anybody could take your stuff because you had no claim in court anymore.
Which is the original meaning of outlaw. You're outside the law. You would no longer have the benefit of the law. And if you're an outlaw and somebody decides to cut off your thumbs and make it into a necklace, then you do not have the option of going to a court and getting a remedy for this injury that was done to you.
Or the philosophy, if they make a mistake, they're worried about a lawsuit, they'll hang you. They'll put you through the ringer. And I know a lot of cases where they'll keep the person in prison just because they know that they know that they're innocent, and the people have come forward and recanted the story, and then they still won't let the person out because then the family will sue for multi-millions. But in retrospect, the family just really wants their family member out of prison because they're innocent.
Again, there seems to be a real perverse incentive for the bureaucrats and the legal system to maintain the status quo. For instance, as you mentioned, that the prosecutors and the judicial machinery would never want to admit that any wrongdoing because there would be liability in that. So the safest way seems to be deny everything and to
hide the paperwork.
Yeah, that frequently what happens in this adversarial system is that the prosecutor does not comply with the Brady ruling that he needs to share information with the defense, and it's routinely done that prosecutors use techniques to prevent the defense from finding the information that they need to defend themselves. And in an adversarial system that we have, how could you expect them to act any differently? Well, Daniel, we're getting pretty close to the end of the hour. Do you have any final words of wisdom that you'd like to share with our listeners?
I mean, I guess what I would just reiterate is the notion that there are no sort of guaranteed solutions to very complicated social problems, and crime is no exception to that. Even though we have we're raised as children that there's a very sort of standard procedure for dealing with crime. You call the police, they go to jail, so on and so forth. But historically, that hasn't always been the case, and contemporarily, our current system is very problematic, and that we would have to confront that. We have to admit to the potentials of alternative systems in order to deal with many of the problems of our current system.
Well, it seems like people are doing that. For instance, in my business, I have a contract that says that if we have a dispute, that we have to go to arbitration rather than to a court of law, and that has been one of the reasons why I've been able to stay out of jail or stay out of the courts for such a long time. And I think the other reason is that probably the most important thing that I found to control lawsuits is to make sure that if you work for somebody, you have to have a personal relationship with them. And in a situation where somebody perceives that the person they're suing is somebody who's arrogant and aloft and just not their kind of people, they usually don't have a relationship with them. That is the people they sue. They don't sue people that they like and people that they have a real personal relationship with. And I think a lot of people in high-risk professions like doctors would probably do well to understand that it has not so much to do with your competence as a doctor, and it has everything to do with is how you're perceived as a human being, whether or not you're going to get sued. That's a little off the topic, but it probably is something that if people took that to heart, they would probably find that they have a whole lot less problems. Okay, well, Daniel, I'd like to thank you for being our guest tonight. It's an extraordinary discussion, and I hope that we can have you again. I know that we have just scratched the surface of a very important subject.
Happy to do it.
And I really appreciate you being on the show tonight.
Thanks for having me.
I look forward to reading your thesis and your article.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. You guys have a good night.
Have a good night, too.